What is the world's biggest concern right now? Conflicts, arguably. The wars in Ukraine and West Asia, they're causing a lot of instability. But what if I told you that far from these conflict zones, there's a new crisis emerging? A $34 trillion debt bomb growing bigger by the day and causing global anxiety. This debt bomb belongs to the United States of America, the richest country in the world, also the biggest debt holder in the world. And when it explodes, this bomb will cause global devastation. The warning comes from the boss of America's biggest bank. His name is Jamie Dimon. He's the CEO of JPMorgan Chase. He says US debt endangers global security. And this debt is humongous. As of today, US borrowing stands at 120% of its GDP. By 2035, this number is set to hit 130%, 130% of America's GDP. That is the level of their debt. And this high level of debt is quite dangerous. Let me quote from what Dimon has said. If you look at that 100% debt to GDP by 2035, I think it's going to be 130%, and it's a hockey stick. That hockey stick does not start yet, but when it starts, markets around the world, there will be a rebellion. What is this hockey stick he's talking about? It's a scenario where high borrowing leads to higher costs, charges to service this debt. And how does it pose a global threat? Again, let me quote. This is about the security of the world. We need a stronger military. We need a stronger America. We need it now. So I put this as a risky thing for all of us. This is risky both for America and its allies and the rest of the world. Many of these allies have bought debt issued by the US government. I'm talking about government bonds. And their exposure is quite high, around $7.6 trillion. That's how much countries around the world have spent. They have bought this debt, $7.6 trillion. And the most vulnerable among them are American allies. I have a list, and topping this list is Japan. Japan owns over $1 trillion of US government debt. The United Kingdom, around $716 billion. Luxembourg, $371 billion. And Canada, $321 billion. And why have so many countries invested in US government debt? Because they thought it's a solid investment. As Joe Biden himself says, we are able to borrow because we always pay our debt. But is that really a guarantee? What happens when the loans keep piling up and the US is unable to catch up? What happens if the United States defaults? All of these countries will lose money. Their economies will be exposed. Some of them are military allies of the US. Canada and the UK, for instance, they're members of NATO. Japan is central to US defense strategy in the East. A default by America will leave all of them weaker, and this is the risk that the JPMorgan chief is referring to. The other big risk, of course, is to the US itself. Such high levels of debt will hurt American defenses. Untamed debt could lead to a budget squeeze. The United States is the world's biggest defense spender. In 2022, it spent over $800 billion on defense. In contrast, the national debt surpassed 100% of the country's GDP, which brings us to the obvious question, how did the US end up with so much debt in the first place? Ironically, one key reason is America's many conflicts. The post-9/11 wars. The United States has spent or sanctioned around $8 trillion on its wars, meaning they've spent $8 trillion on wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and on strengthening America's global security presence. $8 trillion. These wars were financed almost entirely through debt. Since 2001, these loans have ballooned and the interest keeps piling up. I have some estimates from 2020. Experts say the US borrowed some $2 trillion for its global war on terror. By 2030, interest on these loans would spike to $2 trillion. So the US will have to pay $2 trillion in principal and another $2 trillion in interest. So $4 trillion in all. And what happens if this interest keeps piling on, if they don't pay? By 2050, the interest payment alone would be worth some $6.5 trillion. So America's many wars are burning a hole in the taxpayer's pocket. And yet they haven't tightened their belt. This debt is now the biggest vulnerability of the US, not an external enemy, but its own growing pile of debt. And it should worry the world.